You've probably heard the same reasons over and over. Avoidants don't fight for you because they care more about their independence. They're afraid of being vulnerable. They need to stay in control. Sure, those reasons play a part, but they only really scratch the surface. There's a hidden reason almost no one talks about, something far more unsettling than just a fear of vulnerability or a need for independence. And here's the kicker. It's not about control at all. They're afraid that if you fight for them, if they dare to fight back, you'll discover something they've worked their whole lives to keep buried, including from themselves. It's 1917. Swiss psychologist Carl Jung sits in his study deep in thought. He's gone through a breakup of sorts with this guy, Sigmund Freud, his very best friend. He's been wrestling with visions and dreams, strange, unsettling images that won't leave him alone. But instead of turning away from these dark thoughts, Jung dives in, using a technique he calls active imagination. He allows his unconscious mind to speak, and in doing so, he encounters something unexpected. A shadowy figure. This figure is not just a vision, it's a reflection of the parts of himself he's tried to deny, his doubts, his fears, his vulnerabilities. Jung realizes that every person carries this shadow, hidden, unacknowledged traits we push away. The more we reject them, the stronger they become, lurking in our unconscious. From this revelation, Jung develops the concept of the shadow. The parts of ourselves we hide yet must confront if we want to live fully. He writes feverishly, knowing this discovery will shape his understanding of the human psyche for years to come. In this moment, Jung begins to illuminate the darkness within, believing that only by facing our shadow can we become whole. Okay, that's a lot to take in. I promise there's a point to this. For avoidance, especially the fear of someone staying close or fighting for them, is tied to a fear that these hidden, vulnerable parts, their shadow, will be exposed. This includes emotions like fear of rejection, inadequacy, or feeling unworthy of love. In avoidance, this shadow self might manifest as unresolved attachment wounds, deeply buried fears of dependency, or intense emotional needs they're uncomfortable acknowledging. These are aspects of themselves they're afraid will surface if someone gets too close, and why they subconsciously prefer to retreat rather than to fight for a relationship. But in order to understand this, we first need to understand the concept of the facade and the magician's cloak. A few months ago, I filmed this video. In it, I mentioned this idea taken directly from an avoidant who used Jung's active imagination technique to come up with something called the magician's cloak. They likened their life to that as a magician always wearing a cloak. This cloak represents the performative, constructed identity that you feel compelled to wear to gain love and approval. It's tailored to meet the expectations of others at the cost of suppressing your true emotions and needs. All right, keep all of that in mind as I describe what Carl Jung says is the facade. It's best to think of the facade and the shadow as two sides of the same coin. The facade is the mask we present to the world, also known as the persona. It's the socially acceptable version of ourselves shaped by cultural expectations, family, and personal experiences. We craft this facade to fit in, to be liked, and to succeed in society. It reflects what we want others to see: confident, strong, capable. Basically whatever traits we think are most desirable. Sounds super similar to the magician's cloak, right? The shadow, on the other hand, is made up of the parts of ourselves we hide or deny. These are the traits and emotions we don't want to admit we have because they don't fit the image we've created. It can include anger, jealousy, insecurity, or even desires for intimacy and vulnerability. Anything we find unacceptable or shameful is going to reside within the shadow. The more we try to perfect our facade, the more we suppress our shadow. And it's that last sentence that really hammers home why most avoidants won't fight for you. You see, the stronger the facade or the magician's cloak, the deeper and more intense the shadow becomes. The energy we use to uphold the facade forces unwanted emotions and traits into the unconscious, creating a sort of psychological split. Over time, the shadow leaks out in subtle ways through defensiveness, projection, seeing the traits we dislike in others, or self-sabotage. For avoidants, this can be particularly powerful. Their facade may present them as independent and emotionally detached, but beneath the exterior, the shadow could contain fears of rejection, intense longing for connection, or vulnerability. Because they're afraid of revealing these hidden parts of themselves, they distance themselves from any type of close relationships. Basically, they don't want anyone getting close enough to sniff out the fact that there's a shadow lurking within there. The facade and the shadow are in constant tension. The more you build up the facade, the more the shadow grows in the unconscious, waiting to be integrated or faced. But what exactly is in this shadow for avoidance? What is their actual internal narrative like? Well, let's say we take a normal, non-avoidant person and take a look at what their shadow is. You're probably going to get some socially undesirable traits like selfishness, anger, fear of failure. Remember, these are things they don't want to show but can sort of still recognize within themselves. Now let's compare that to an avoidance shadow. You're going to have fear of emotional dependency. The avoidance facade is all about being self-reliant, detached, and in control, but deep in their shadow is a fear of being emotionally dependent on someone else. Their internal narrative literally might be, I can't need anyone because needing someone makes me weak and unworthy. They fear that if they get too close, they're going to lose their independence and experience an insane amount of pain. Then you have a longing for connection. They're going to consciously avoid intimacy, but in their shadow lies a powerful, often repressed desire for deep connection. The internal narrative here could be something like, I want to be close to someone, but if I let them in, they're going to see the parts of me that aren't lovable. They crave connection, but they've buried it so deeply that even thinking or acknowledging it becomes dangerous for them. Then you have the fear of being unworthy or defective. So this is a common trait in avoidance where they believe that if someone gets too close, they'll discover something wrong with them. Their internal story here could be, if they knew who I really am, they wouldn't want me. So to protect themselves, they push people away, ensuring no one gets so close that they can sniff that hidden part of themselves out. Then you have guilt and shame. The shadow for avoidance often includes guilt about hurting others with their emotional distance, but they suppress that guilt to maintain the facade of being unaffected. Their internal narrative here might be, it's better to stay distant than risk hurting someone or myself. They feel shame, but they're not gonna face it, at least not directly. Then you have the conflict between autonomy and intimacy. So avoidants obviously value their independence. Their shadow holds a deep conflict. Their internal dialogue could be, I want to be close, but I can't give up control. If I let go of my autonomy, my independence, I might lose myself. Now this tug of war is going on inside of them at all times. And while someone with a normal shadow can identify and accept their flaws as part of the human experience, avoidants tend to bury those same desires and fears much deeper. The shadow holds the parts of them that conflict with the idealized and independent facade that they project. Facing this shadow means confronting fears of unworthiness, vulnerability, and the possibility that their perceived strength is built on emotional avoidance rather than resilience. And what unfolds is this truly brutal cycle. The closer an avoidant partner tries to get, the more the avoidant clings to their facade of self-reliance. On the surface, they seem unfazed, but underneath their shadow, the part of themselves they've hidden grows. The shadow whispers fears of vulnerability, unworthiness, and rejection. The avoidant believes that if they let down their guard, they'll be exposed. As the fight for connection continues, the avoidant's internal tension mounts. Instead of breaking down the walls, they reinforce them. Eventually, the person fighting for them gives up, confirming the avoidance shadow narrative, everyone leaves me. And here's the painful truth. It does confirm the avoidant's deepest fears, but it also confirms something kind of more disturbing. They have this belief that this is the only way to survive in relationships. And so the cycle repeats. Someone tries to love them. They retreat further into their shadow, proving to themselves over and over again that love will only lead to abandonment. But an interesting thing does happen when a shadow goes unchecked in this cycle for a long, repeated period of time. Imagine the avoidance world as a pipe. At first, the pipe works fine. Emotions flow through it, but over time, they start to block it. Anytime an avoidant suppresses a fear of connection or vulnerability, it's like adding more debris to this pipe. The facade they cling to, their need to appear independent and unaffected, acts as a valve, preventing any of these feelings from being released. But here's the thing about pressure. It builds. Over time, the pipe gets more and more clogged, and the pressure inside rises. Instead of releasing these emotions in healthy ways by expressing in a calm manner what they're feeling, the avoidant tightens the valve even more, refusing to let anything out. Eventually, though, that pressure becomes too much. The pipe bursts. This is when the shadow leaks out. The avoidant, having clung to their facade, their magician's cloak for so long, begins to unravel. Their suppressed emotions, guilt, shame, fear, erupt in ways they can't control. It might come out as sudden anger, irritability, or even pushing away someone they care about. The very thing they've been avoiding, emotional exposure, comes pouring out to destroy whatever connection they are clinging onto or want in the first place. In essence, the more the avoidant holds back, the more likely it is that their hidden emotions will explode, sabotaging relationships and reinforcing their belief that closeness only leads to pain. And this does make sense. Last year, I had the pleasure of interviewing this guy, Dr. John Paul Garrison. In my interview with him, he had the following to say about avoidance.
When you think about avoidant is anxiety, really, because anxiety is built around the concept of avoidance. We can't be anxious and not avoid. It just comes with the territory.
Avoidance is anxiety. At the root of the shadow, especially for avoidance, there's often a deep underlying anxiety. The shadow is made up of the parts of ourselves that we reject or deny, and those repressed aspects are often tied to deep fears and insecurities. We know this. I've spent the last 10 minutes talking about this. For avoidance, this likely includes anxiety about being unworthy of love, fear of emotional dependence, or even a fear of losing their sense of self in relationships. This anxiety drives the avoidant to distance themselves emotionally and hide behind their facade. But it's also the very thing that causes their shadow to grow. The more they push these fears into the unconscious, the more their anxiety festers, leading to an even stronger need to protect the facade, until the pressure eventually bursts, as we discussed. So again, at the core of the avoidance shadow lies anxiety. Fear of being seen, fear of being hurt, fear of losing control. This anxiety fuels the cycle of emotional withdrawal and avoidance. You know, it's interesting, just about every single video I post about avoidant behavior on this YouTube channel, an actual avoidant will get in touch in the comments and say something like, "I'm avoidant. How do I stop treating people this way?" And my normal answer is honestly a little generic. Hey, work towards being more secure. But I actually think this answer is a disservice to the reality of the situation. I mean, take the shadow concept we've been talking about here. Jung recommends integrating your shadow, a process that will take years at a minimum, but in some cases can take your entire life to do. The fundamental problem is that avoidance is a defense mechanism. It's an ingrained behavior. You're not going to wake up one day as an avoidant and just sit there and say, "Hey, I'm taking my magician's cloak off today. No problem." So what are you supposed to do? Well, you start small. The goal isn't to cure avoidance overnight, but to slowly bring awareness to the parts of yourself that you've been avoiding. This is about beginning the work of acknowledging your shadow, those fears of vulnerability, your anxieties around emotional closeness, and the discomfort you feel when someone tries to love you. You can't just throw off the magician's cloak that you've kept hidden for so long, but you can start peeking underneath it, little by little, allowing yourself to get closer to the parts of yourself that you've buried. This doesn't mean tearing down your walls all at once. It means getting curious about why they're there and what purpose they're serving. And while that may seem like a lame answer, it's actually more profound than you think. Whenever I do one of these videos, I do a lot of research. And in my research for this particular video, I stumbled across this comment on a forum. I once spent time weighing if improving my own availability would help fix things with my fearful avoidant ex. I found this board after I tipped over and insecure. What cemented things for me was reading all start to finish relationship descriptions with suspected FA partners. Every single thread on this board, seriously, not one told a different story. Not one partner came here looking for answers to work on their relationships with an aware and willing FA partner. And for all those twisting for their unaware partners, the details were different, but the patterns all played out the same every time. Here's the hard truth. Most avoidants, even when they're aware of their avoidance and want to cure it, never bother to come back to center. I showed you one tiny comment on that forum, but it wasn't just this one story I stumbled across. It was countless stories of people trying to make things work with their avoidant partners. The details varied, but the pattern was almost always the same. An avoidant partner, emotionally distant, unwilling to meet in the middle. And that's the real challenge. It's not just about awareness. It's about the willingness to do the hard, uncomfortable work to face your shadow, your defenses, your deepest fears. But most avoidants, they're not going to. They won't. They stay in their comfort zone, locked behind their facade, because it feels safer than risking vulnerability. So if you're an avoidant and you're even sitting there thinking about doing shadow work, of confronting that part of yourself that you've been hiding, well, you're already miles ahead in my book.